Have you ever seen someone smile and feel a chill run down your spine? It wasn't the smile itself, it was the way it didn't belong. It stretched across the face tight and forced like a paper mask drawn in crayon and stapled to skin. That's the expression James Holmes wore in court long after the theater fell silent. 12 people gone, 70 others wounded, all in just a few minutes, in a place meant for laughter and escape. It was July 20th, 2012, Aurora, Colorado, midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises. Families, couples, friends, all packed into Theater 9. He came in wearing full body armor, black tactical gear, gas mask, rifle, shotgun, handgun, tossed a gas canister and began shooting. Systematically, calculated. Cold. He didn't run, he didn't cry, he didn't explain. When police arrested him behind the theater, he simply said, "I am the Joker."
But he wasn't laughing, not really.
In the days that followed, I was asked to consult on the case not as a prosecutor, not to defend, but to understand. Because beneath every crime like this is a question that has haunted me for decades. What breaks inside a child to make them believe murder is the only way to be seen? Is it one moment, 1,000 small cuts? Or a silence so deep that it swallows the scream before it ever leaves their lips? This story isn't about sympathy. It's about sight, about seeing what we refuse to look at until it was too late. And it begins not in a theater, but in a quiet room long before the first door ever locked. There was a teddy bear once, torn, missing an eye, sat slumped in the corner of a boy's room that was too quiet for childhood. James was born in San Diego in 1987. By all external accounts, his family looked stable. His father was a scientist, his mother a registered nurse. But behind the framed photographs and polite smiles, there was a stillness, a coldness that crept into the walls like winter air through a cracked window. Some children cry to be held. James, I suspect, learned early that no one would come. Not really. He wasn't abused, at least not in the way people want to hear, but love wasn't loud in that house. It didn't dance in the kitchen or curl up at night by the fireplace. It was functional, clinical, like a duty checked off a list. I once interviewed someone who knew him as a toddler. They said he rarely made eye contact even back then, that he stared at the floor when spoken to, that he seemed somewhere else. There were nights when dishes broke, not in rage but in silence. A plate slipping from hands that were too tired to care. Doors that closed softly then locked. Conversations that floated above his head like clouds he was never invited to touch. He wasn't neglected, but he wasn't known. And that distinction matters. Because when a child begins to feel invisible, something begins to shift. The world becomes a screen, and they the ghost behind it. Watching, listening, slowly learning to hide from a world that never asked them to be real. I imagine James holding that teddy bear once, staring into its one remaining eye, and wondering, if I disappear, will anyone even notice? He was always the last to be picked. That seems like such a small thing. A moment on the playground, a line of boys choosing teammates, laughter shouting sneakers on gravel, and one boy waiting, always waiting, until there was no choice left but him. James was quiet, polite, never started fights, never shouted in class. But that's not the same as being liked. It's just a different kind of invisibility. At school he drifted, brilliant in science, lost in everything else. When other children laughed in the cafeteria, James sat with a book or with no one. The teachers praised his intelligence, but intelligence doesn't keep you warm when you're 10 and eating alone. The other boys called him weird. They mocked his silence, the way his eyes flicked back and forth like he was calculating escape routes in his head. He didn't fight back, just lowered his head and moved away. But the bruises from that kind of loneliness don't show up on skin. They settle deeper in the wiring. They whisper lies into your bloodstream. You're different. You don't belong. No one cares. And the child begins to listen. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if someone had sat beside him. Not because they had to, just because they wanted to know what he was thinking. But no one did. Instead, he learned to endure, to build an inner world where no one could touch him, where he was safe but completely alone.
One classmate later said he was like air. You knew he was there, but you never really saw him.
That's the moment when the seeds are planted not of violence, but of disconnection. And every time he walked past a group of laughing children, I think a part of him whispered, "I'll show you. I'll make you see me."
The first time he lied, no one noticed.
It was small, a missing homework assignment. He said he forgot it at home, but when no one questioned him, a switch flicked inside. Puberty is a storm for every teenager, but for James it was more like a quiet unraveling. No outbursts, no rebellion, just a slow retreat inward. He began talking to himself, whispers in empty rooms, practicing voices, conversations that never happened. By 14, the mask was forming. He still got straight A's, still showed up on time, still said thank you and yes, sir, but the smile no longer touched anything beneath his skin. It was practiced, calculated, a social camouflage. Inside things were shifting. He once shoved a classmate down the stairs. No one saw. No one asked. And he didn't do it again for a while. But when he talked about it later in therapy, his voice didn't carry guilt, just curiosity. Like he was experimenting with gravity, only this time people were the test subjects. There were also signs in his journals, drawings that spiraled inward, people with no faces, pages torn out then taped back in. At the bottom of one entry was a single word, hollow. He craved connection but couldn't bear rejection, so he started choosing control instead. If people were going to hurt him or ignore him, he would make sure it happened on his terms. He began manipulating small things, stealing a candy bar just to see if he could, setting his alarm for 3 a.m. to test how long he could stay awake, watching violent movies alone in the dark.
He wasn't spiraling, he was training.
And every night he stared into the bathroom mirror, whispering to his reflection, "One day they'll see. One day they'll all see."
He learned to smile with his whole face, but never his eyes.
By the time James entered college, you'd never guess there was anything broken beneath the surface. He was tall, soft-spoken, intelligent. He had a gentle voice, a sharp mind, and could speak just enough to pass as normal, maybe even charming in a quiet, awkward way.
But it was all theater.
He dated once or twice, attended parties, chatted politely with professors, but every connection was filtered through calculation. What should I say here? How long should I hold this smile? Will this joke make me seem human?
It's exhausting to pretend, but he did it flawlessly. In one of his graduate classes, a peer said, he was nice, I guess. But there was something off, like he was always slightly delayed, like his eyes were behind glass.
And that's how it often is with people like James. They don't scream for help. They rehearse normalcy. They study human behavior the way you'd study a foreign language. Smile here, nod there, blend in. Inside, he was deteriorating. The voices had names now. The fantasies were getting sharper. And the emptiness, it grew louder. He journaled obsessively. Pages and pages about the illusion of morality, about fate, about being chosen for something greater. But none of that leaked outside. No one saw, no one asked.
He even sought help once briefly, but when the psychologist didn't see him the way he wanted, he shut down again. The mask didn't crack, it thickened.
And through it all, he kept returning to the same question, one that he once scrawled at the bottom of a notebook page in red pen. If I disappeared today, would anyone even remember what my voice sounded like? It wasn't a scream, it was silence. That's what often comes before the break. Not rage, not fire, but a quiet collapse. A door shutting softly, a voicemail that isn't returned, a look of indifference from someone whose face used to matter. James was struggling by 2012. His academic performance at the University of Colorado was slipping. Once praised for his brilliance in neuroscience, now he was unraveling under pressure. He failed his oral exams, was placed on academic probation. Everything he'd built, his mask, his identity, his future, was beginning to crumble. But the real trigger wasn't just academic failure, it was personal erasure.
He reached out for help again, sent emails to a school psychiatrist, vague, coded references to harm. But there was no intervention. No one knocked on his door. One professor described him as odd but not alarming, and so he vanished bit by bit from their concern.
He withdrew from the program. And in that emptiness, something hardened. I've seen this before, when someone feels rejected not just by people but by the system they once trusted to hold them, to validate their worth. That's when the narrative shifts from pain to punishment, from why me to you'll all pay. Somewhere in that time, James began planning, buying weapons, ordering thousands of rounds of ammunition online, sketching out the crime scene like a blueprint for revenge. It was meticulous, mechanical, detached. He even mailed a journal filled with violent drawings and fantasies to his former psychiatrist before the attack, but it arrived too late. A neighbor would later say they saw him standing alone in his apartment staring out the window at nothing. Not angry, not scared, just blank.
That's what chills me most. The emptiness.
The first time I saw the security footage from the theater parking lot, I paused it at his face. And I swear his eyes weren't just cold. They were gone. Like whatever was human had already left. It was never about rage. People want to believe these killers are boiling over with fury, that something just snaps. But that's not what I've seen, not with James. What I saw was something worse. A calm, a silence so deep it became a weapon. He walked into the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises dressed in full tactical gear. Body armor, black gloves, a gas mask. He looked more like a soldier from a nightmare than a young man. There were over 400 people inside Theater 9, families, friends, teenagers holding popcorn. It was a space meant for joy escape story. He propped open a side door, returned moments later armed with a shotgun, an assault rifle, and a Glock, tossed a gas canister, and opened fire. I'm not here to retell the horror. You've read the numbers. You've heard the screams in headlines, 12 dead, 70 others wounded. What haunts me is not the bullets. It's the stillness inside him.
He later described it as surreal, like watching himself from outside his own body. Clinical, dissociated, but also right. Like everything had led to this moment. Like the chaos around him finally matched the chaos within.
Some survivors said he didn't shout, didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, just moved from row to row like a conductor of silence. And when the gun jammed, he didn't panic. He turned and walked outside. Police arrested him without resistance, found him standing by his car weapons, discarded body armor still on. He told them he was the Joker, but he wasn't laughing, not even smiling. I once described this mental state in another case. It's not about power, it's about control. In that moment, the shooter becomes the god of a small, terrible world. Everything stops, and they are finally seen. After the last shot echoed, he didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stood there as if the performance was over, and he was waiting for the curtain to fall.
There were no words, just blinking.
When James sat in the interrogation room, the first thing the officer noticed was how he looked. Lost, not defiant, not proud, just disoriented, like someone waking up from a long, vivid dream. I've studied dozens of post-crime behaviors. Some killers gloat, some collapse, some try to run, but James... He sat still, barely responsive. When he did speak, it was in soft tones, measured, detached. He didn't seem triumphant, but he wasn't remorseful either. That's the paradox. He told examiners he had no real emotional reaction after the shooting. He felt numb, and when asked what he expected to happen afterward, he simply said, "I thought I'd die." But he didn't die. The world didn't end. Instead, he woke up in a cell, stripped of his armor, alone with his thoughts. That's when the cracks began to show. He became increasingly withdrawn, refused to eat, spoke in fragmented sentences. Sometimes he laughed inappropriately. Other times he said nothing at all. I don't believe he wanted to kill again, but I do believe he was prepared to disappear completely. Like the shooting was a full stop, an end to a story he no longer wanted to keep writing. Some forensic experts debated whether it was psychosis, depression, schizophrenia, but labels don't capture the texture of a soul left hollow. What I saw was a man whose identity had fused with his act. There was no future, no past, just the echo of that moment in Theater 9 replaying endlessly in his mind. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't pretending anymore. He was simply James exposed, emptied, and terrifyingly free. There's something haunting about seeing a killer without their costume. No armor, no mask, no gas canister, just a prison jumpsuit, shackled hands, eyes that don't quite focus. That's what I saw the first time I watched James Holmes in his early court hearings. He didn't glare, didn't snarl, he didn't even seem present. His hair dyed a garish orange had already begun to fade. His expression was blank, but not in a defiant way. It was childlike, distant, like someone watching the world from underwater. He sat in the courtroom as survivors wept, as families described their grief. And he blinked, occasionally shifted in his seat. Once he looked up, but not at anyone. Just up. I've often wondered what he saw when he finally looked in the mirror, not in the bathroom of his apartment. I mean the real mirror, the one that doesn't lie, the one you face when everything's been stripped away. What's left when there's no performance to hide behind? During his psychiatric evaluations, there were moments, fleeting ones, when James spoke of pain. He admitted to suicidal thoughts, described feeling like his brain was broken, but he never cried, never pleaded for forgiveness. One psychologist described it perfectly. He wasn't a monster. He was a vacuum, a space where emotion should have been. And that's the hardest thing for society to accept, that sometimes the most dangerous people don't feel dangerous at all. They feel empty. But there was one moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when a victim's mother shouted his name in court. James flinched. Not much, just a flicker, but enough. And in that half second, I didn't see a murderer. I saw a frightened boy trapped in a grown man's body, terrified that the world had finally turned to look at him and only saw the damage. The truth is, this story didn't begin with bullets. It began with a child who didn't feel seen, with quiet dinners, locked doors, a classroom where no one asked if he was okay. It began with the absence of voices that should have said, "You matter, you belong." By the time James Holmes pulled that trigger, the world had already lost him. Not in a single moment, but piece by piece. A slow erosion of connection, empathy, visibility. And I don't say that to excuse anything. What he did was unforgivable. But understanding isn't the same as forgiving. It's a mirror we hold up to ourselves to ask hard questions about the silence we normalize.
How many children sit alone at lunch while we look away? How many young people write about hopelessness in journals no one reads? How many reach out once, don't feel heard, and never reach out again? You see, the crime didn't start in that theater.
It started in a living room where the television was louder than conversation. In a classroom where the quiet kid never got called on. In a counselor's office where a vague threat was met with a shrug. If someone had stepped in sooner, would anything have changed?
Maybe not, but maybe.
Maybe a moment of human connection, a real one, might have fractured the story before it hardened into tragedy. We like to think we'd recognize a monster, but the truth is most of them look just like the kid down the street, the classmate, the neighbor, the coworker with the too long stare and the too soft voice. And as I close this file, I wonder how many more James Holmeses are out there, just waiting to be seen before it's too late.